Hello and welcome. My name is Leslie Thompson. I'm Director of Workplace Segment Strategy for Target North America. Today, our roundtable discussion will focus on a very important diversity, equity, and inclusion question. Where are we on the journey to humanizing enterprise so that it is truly for everyone, and what role does design play in taking us there? In 2020 research with Cornet Global, Target explored the extent to which diversity and inclusion is changing commercial design. Now, in partnership with HOK, we seek a deeper understanding of the role neurodiversity plays in designing a truly inclusive workplace. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today on our presentation on neurodiversity and workplace inclusivity. My name is Sarah Oppenhuizen. I am the Director of Interiors for HOK Chicago, and I'd like Mary Kate to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Mary Kate Cassidy. I'm a Senior Project Interior Designer in Chicago for HOK.
And I'm Kay Sargent. I'm Director of Workplace for HOK based out of Washington, D.C.
And today we want to talk about an issue that started with a simple question. This came about 3 to 4 years ago. A client asked us, how do we accommodate neurodivergence in the workplace? And this set off a lot of research and investigation into how can we design workplaces that truly account for the entire population. And how do you design for people with ADHD? That conversation spurred 4 different publications, which you can see on the slide here. The first report that we developed built the case around designing a neurodiverse workplace. The second talked through what does that mean for us as designers moving forward. The third talked about the principle and elements of design and how do you actually implement this into a workplace. And finally, the fourth report dives into hypo and hypersensitive elements of design. And all of these are available online. So when you talk about neurodiversity, we are living in a time of increased diagnosis and awareness around people who have or who are on the autism spectrum, who have Tourette's, ADHD, dyslexia, and Parkinson. And this has just been elevated within the public knowledge. And people who are neurodiverse are just wired differently. They need different types of spaces. And their skills, their thought process can be an extraordinary strength to the workplace, but they need some different accommodations than people who are not neurodivergent. So 1 in 8 people are actually considered neurodiverse, but less than 50% know it.
So let's dig into a little bit about what some of the challenges that people that are neurodiverse might face. So 85 to 90% of adults that have ADHD may not know it because, quite frankly, it was underdiagnosed for years. Yet we have a new generation that are acutely aware about their condition and are well prepared and well armed to come into the workplace expecting the accommodations for them. We also know that adults with ADHD that go untreated tend to lose an average of 22 days of productivity every single year, which is a huge loss in the workplace. That they are 18 times more likely to be disciplined or to be considered behavioral issues and 60% more likely to lose their job. That depression impacted 14.8 million Americans before COVID. COVID has now made that significantly higher. And although depression isn't directly considered a neurodiverse condition, many argue that it actually is, and the majority of people that have neurodiversity are also depressed and they suffer from anxiety. That 65% of the 1.2 million Americans that are on the diverse spectrum have above average intelligence. These are really, really smart people, but 85% of them remain under or unemployed, which is just tragic, especially in a time where we need the best talent. But there are also lots of advantages that we can think about when we think about people that have neurodiverse tendencies as well. They tend to have extreme brilliance. They tend to be big picture thinkers. They think out of the box. They tend to really kind of go for like no limits. They tend to be super hyper focused, which is why a lot of companies like Microsoft are focusing on hiring people that are autistic, because they found that they can be very, very focused and be incredibly productive. They tend to think about the bigger picture. They tend to stretch the boundaries, think outside the box again, which is also why a lot of entrepreneurs tend to be neurodivergent because, again, they aren't restricted. They have that capacity for innovation that really can kind of take them in that whole new direction. And we also have found that autistic professionals, when they are involved in a work program, have actually proven to be 92% more productive than their coworkers, which is amazing when you really think about that level of additional productivity that they can bring to the table. And they tend to thrive under pressure, right? So a lot of times they've lived their entire life under very stressful environments, and they tend to thrive under pressure. And in our world, you know, that can be really helpful. I mean, if you're in the real estate or the facilities world or the realm, you know, you don't have on your calendar that a pipe is going to burst at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Thursday. So be prepared for that, right? So that ability to kind of take anything that comes at you really can be a huge asset. And so we really look at some of these advantages as really almost being a superpower. And I think most people that we've spoken to in all of this research who are neurodiverse really do consider and embrace this as their superpower. So when we were talking to a lot of individuals doing our research, we had this wonderful quote, and it's one of my favorite, is that we are freshwater fish in salt water. If you put us in fresh water, we will function just fine. But if you put us in salt water, we will struggle to survive. And I think that's really the onus is on us to create compelling environments. And so now we're living in a world that has been changed dramatically because of COVID. And as we go forward, we really need to think about how that is impacting all of us. And, you know, people that are neurodiverse tend to have heightened sensitivities to stimulation, but this little virus has had a big impact on all of us. And now you could actually argue that everyone has a heightened sensitivity to their surroundings. And really, it's important for us to really understand it and to embrace that. And we've learned a ton from all of our research. But one of the things I think that's really important is that people that are neurodiverse tend to spike really high or really low on their response to sensory stimulation. But most of us really lack sensory intelligence. Most of us don't understand how we're impacted by those things. And all of us, even neurotypicals, are impacted by the sensory realm that we're in. And so in this new era that we're living in, understanding that is really critical. And we've taken a lot of the principles that apply to neurodiversity and have been able to really incorporate that into best practices for creating environments that make everyone, neurodivergence and neurotypicals, feel more welcome. And a colleague of ours, Mara Baum, always says that when you design for the extreme, you benefit the mean. So if we employ these principles, it can have a positive impact on everyone. So over to you, Mary Kate.
Sounds good. So when we talk about neurodiversity, we think of it as a spectrum. So we think of the center of the spectrum as people who are neurotypical. But on one end of the spectrum is a group of people who we refer to as hypersensitive. So these are the type of people who basically prefer less sensory stimuli in the space. They want spaces that are more controlled, predictable environments, lower light levels typically, less vibrant colors and patterns, less variation to the sensory attributes in the space. On the other end of the spectrum would be the people that we refer to as hyposensitive. So this group basically wants an overload of sensory stimuli. They want the bright colors, high contrast, vivid patterns, just a lot more, even acoustic value in the space, a lot more sensory stimuli in the environment. And so we started to think about, exactly what this means for design. How can we translate this into the spaces that we design every day? And what's so important is evaluating the spectrum of neurodiversity from hyposensitive to hyper. but also looking at the different sensory challenges within each space that we design for. So how something sounds, what the acoustics are, how it looks, what it feels like, what it smells like, and how close or far away in proximity you are to something. These are all things that really, lead to the overall success of the space, and nothing works independently. It all has to work together to be able to create a successful environment. And so we started breaking that down then. So, we've identified the spectrum, and we understand that every space that we design has to have an option to have choice and control over your space. So you have to give a variety of different types of spaces and a diversity to those different types of environments. So we look at the spectrum on the top from hyposensitive to hypersensitive, and then we kind of created this design matrix of different small charrettes of design ideas. On the left-hand side, evaluating it through all of the different types of sensory attributes and thinking about what that means for a hypersensitive person who wants less acoustics or, a quieter space versus a hyposensitive person who wants more vivid tactile experience. And so what we say is, we look at this matrix, but basically every single space we design has to be made up of a variety of these types of environments. And so going forward specifically for workplace, we divided this by 6 different types of work specific for workplace design. So places to focus, to process, create, places for meeting spaces, conference rooms, places to refresh after a meeting, and also spaces to socialize with the entire office. And so what does that mean for someone who's hypersensitive versus hyposensitive? You have to design for a variety of sensory attributes and design ideas across the spectrum, but you also have to break it down by space type. So for example, in the top left corner here, we're showing a hypersensitive space for someone to focus. So that would be a focus room that's kind of off the beaten path, enclosed, quieter, has a safer feeling to it, versus the complete opposite of, in the bottom right-hand corner, a social space for someone who's hyposensitive. They want to be sitting right in the middle of all the action, have kind of a loud buzz around them, probably brighter colors, more vivid patterns and textures, and a lot more of a stimulating sensory experience.
So, Mary Kay, I'm going to tag in and I'm going to take you on the left side of this chart. So if you think about, for concentrate, I think a lot of companies today have done a really good job of creating kind of focus rooms or focus booths to help people kind of eliminate the distractions. And that's great for people that are hypersensitive. But if you're hyposensitive, being locked in that small room can really be totally overwhelming. And so they need spaces that maybe have fidget furniture, they can move, they can stand, they can write on the wall. That's a little bit shielded and a little bit isolated, but they're not so boxed in. And even in the hypersensitive category, it's not just about creating the space. As designers, we're all very passionate about wanting to create beautiful spaces with lots of colors and patterns, et cetera. And so we've seen a lot of cases where people tend to create and put those patterns and bright colors in those spaces to make them more compelling. But if you think about it, if we go to the next slide, Sarah, we can see that literally sometimes having all of that color in those small spaces actually is totally overwhelming. So if you're trying to create a space where people can control the amount of stimulation, you really need to think it all the way through. Like the space to the left that has a quiet on the door, that might be a little bit better, right? It's the right colors, et cetera. But we need to think about the application as well as we go forward. So the goal here really is to think about this is how do we take those 6 modalities of work that Mary Kate talked about and a hyper and a hypo version and blend those into an environment seamlessly. Seamlessly is really an important part of this, because just like we do with handicap accessibility, we want to make it so that the entire environment is as inclusive as possible and people can find the spaces that are right for them. So creating, even in a small space like this, where we can get those 6 modalities and the different versions, hypo and hyper in them, it's really important that we design to have that inclusivity. And so when we start thinking about the landscape and a typical neighborhood and what that typical neighborhood might look like, Sarah, if you want to go to the next slide, please. Thank you. then we can start really seeing that we can create kind of a hyper-sensitive version and a hypo-sensitive. So even again, in the small space, we can create kind of a more balanced setting that gives people options and choices and control. And this really gets to the heart of one size misfits all. The most important thing that we can do is give people options and choices so they can find the right environment for themselves.
So on these slides, I won't get into all the detail because you're seeing a lot here, but I kind of want to break down how these slides work. So we talked about those 6 modalities of work, and our research really goes into each one of those modalities and then evaluating kind of, where those spaces fit in the ecosystem, as Kay talked about, and then what does that mean for the exact design attributes that we need to apply to those spaces. So I want to say that, we have a lot of detail here because at HOK, as designers at HOK, there's an art behind everything we do. And, we definitely like everything to look pretty and be designed well, but there is an absolute science behind everything we do. So, we really look at the research and we design based on what we found. So you see the ecosystem on the left. This would be a focus space, for example. The blue dot highlights where that hypersensitive focus space would be, and the pink space highlights the hyposensitive focus space. And on the right, we've just broken down, the exact design attributes for what that means, how you should apply color in that space, what the texture should be like, what the acoustic treatment should be like, even down to the furniture. So if you kind of through, you'll watch as the pink and blue bubbles kind of shift throughout the ecosystem. But really what we're showing here is just going through each one of those 6 modalities and showing how, we've gone through the research of what these spaces actually need to be designed for. So, you can see how they shift throughout the plan. It's important in proximity where these spaces are to each other, but it's, just as important to get into the details of exactly what those colors, flooring materials, lighting, acoustic treatments, how we need to design for each of these spaces.
So in addition to this being the right thing to do, to design for inclusivity, there's definitely a business case behind this in order to design workplaces that address mindfulness, health, safety, and well-being. And so what we wanted to do now is walk through a few images that show how do we take all of this science behind the neurodiversity and put it actually into the design of the space. So this reception area shows a lot of strong contrasts coupled with neutral materials. This is Stryker's office in Burlington, Ontario. It helps people feel grounded in a sophisticated setting, but it's calming. You've got access to water and beverages. There's a hospitality feel that helps people feel welcome. And being able to wash your hands right when you come in is obviously another important concern in the COVID era. But there are just lots of elements that just help people feel safe as they're arriving in a new space. When you talk about lobbies or transition areas, the concept here was about clear lines, easy navigation. There are some splashes of color that add interest. Strong images reinforce branding and aid in the wayfinding. But again, natural materials, varied ceiling heights, different light levels start to define different areas within the space through subtle cues. And a bunch of different diverse work settings accommodate different various user needs. It's still welcoming and harmonious, but coupling all of those elements together. When we look at gathering spaces, creating lots of different types, as Mary Kate and Kay have noted earlier, is going to be very important. That it's not always just about sitting at a meeting table, that having, locations where you can write on a whiteboard, where you can change how your position is, whether you're on the bench by the wall or seated at a group around the table. It just enables a more meaningful interaction. You can also see here we've used color to reinforce some ideas and different textures within the space. When you talk about refreshing spaces, we now more than ever need to create environments that enable mindfulness, that are a relief from the stress of the day, that provide comfort. So there's some crisp white furniture, a drop ceiling, some really interesting lighting. The saturated colors make this area of Convene's co-working space in LA an oasis from the rest of the workplace and just a place for people to step away and refresh. Activity spaces are also important. These spaces are areas where individuals can go, get the excess energy out, socialize with friends in acceptable ways in a work setting, connect with people in casual ways on their own terms. This is a key element in helping people decompress and as part of the workplace as well, in addition to the refresh spaces. In passageways, these are areas that can be activated. This is done in this location by the use of color in Convene, creates visual interest while highlighting and defining different seating areas, and creates individual areas within the larger open office space. The graphic element along the stairs ties spaces together and acts as a wayfinding element as well. Common spaces are a great place to reinforce the idea of prospect and refuge. So what that is it relates back to this savanna effect, where humans instinctively seek safety and access to the essentials and comfort. And it's a very subconscious thing that we all know when we feel safe. And part of that has to do with the ability to see your surroundings, to see what's going on, but still be able to find your own little niche within that space. It can be very unsettling if you can't get your bearings in a space. So we need to have that line of sight and be able to establish our sense of comfort within it. So all of this to say, we are no longer just designing environments. We are designing experiences for the well-being of people.
So, Leslie, back over to you all to see if there are any questions that we might be able to address.
Oh, so many. But first, how does this impact flooring? And if you could give us a list of maybe the top 5 to 10 items that you think are most important when considering surfacing materials, that would be great.
The David Letterman reveal. Okay. All right. We got you on that one, because that's a question we get asked all the time. So ladies, let's go for it. Sarah and Mary Kate, dive in.
Yeah, I'll start.
Okay.
So maintenance is a big one. Obviously, we want to make sure that any products that are being installed, any flooring, that you're considering the lifetime of that product. The smell or off-gassing of adhesives, you think about if someone's neurodiverse in the space, they may have heightened sensitivity to smell, and that's going to have an impact on them. Obviously, this ties into sustainability and LEED credentials as well, but it's an important thing to consider for neurodiversity. Temperature is an interesting one because we have this innate perception around that concrete is cold and plush carpets are warm. And that when you're selecting flooring, picking something that contributes to the overall feeling of the space and how that might impact somebody who's neurodiverse is important. Friction. People want to feel secure in their surroundings. And if the floor is slippery, that's going to be a problem. We've all stepped on the floor in a high heel and like it starts to slide a little bit and that, you're all of a sudden you're jostled. So making sure that whatever you're selecting is appropriate for the space. And then texture. You think about, again, an LVT being smooth versus carpets having different kinds of textures. It's very important from a neurodiverse perspective to think about how different, a plush carpet will feel different and contribute to a different type of feeling than an LVT will. I'm going to hand it over to Mary Kate for the top 5.
Sounds good. You do a good David Letterman. So tone is super important in, creating the vibe of the space. Are you feeling invigorated by the color, or is it a more calming tone to the color? That's a really important value. Creating space definitions and territories. So when you change up the flooring material in the space, you feel like you're kind of entering a new zone or a new space. You might feel more sheltered by sitting in one defined territory over the other. So space is really important. Pattern is super important, and we know especially Tarkett offers flooring products of many different patterns. So is the pattern very complex, and could it be disorienting if you look down at the floor and you see a very complex pattern, or is there clarity that can kind of guide you? we find that people who are neurodiverse, some, not all, have kind of an aversion to looking people in the eye when they're talking. So if they're at work, at their job, they might find themselves looking down at the floor more. So pattern is very important as far as that disorienting factor. Orientation and how flooring helps you navigate through the space. I even think of orientation as like, you know, how you're applying the flooring product. For example, if you have like a wood look LVT, it could look very calming and give you some sense of clarity if it's just installed in a linear orientation. But if you install that same piece of flooring material in a herringbone pattern, you're going to get a lot more variety there. And acoustics, number one. I don't know if that's how David Letterman would announce it, but I think he was probably better at this. But acoustics is very important. So we even think of like a rubber flooring material, obviously will have less sound reverberation through the space when you're walking on it, versus a VCT would have a lot more of kind of an echo or a sound to that. Those would be our David Letterman's top 10.
Excellent. You did a great job. So would we, are you ladies open to a little more Q&A? We have a couple
let's do it.
Sure.
So with all the research that you've done, how do you know which spaces to include and or to what degree those spaces and types should be applied when you're working with a client?
So I think the key element here, if I might dive in, is that you want to do an assessment of the space first. You know, this is very important to know your culture and to know what exactly the people in your group need, right? Because it's going to be different if you're part of a creative firm versus an accounting or financial services. There's going to be a different set of things that need to be assessed prior to diving into what needs to be applied into an individual space. Now, ideally, you're going to have things across the spectrum, and but you may need to increase hyposensitive spaces depending on your team or the workplace that you're designing, versus some of the more hypersensitive spaces, again, based on, you know, the type of group that you have. There are easy things that can be tackled as well. And you know, we can talk a little bit more about those. Where if you already look and say, okay, I have a lot of color in my space right now, and maybe that needs to be toned back a little bit, or vice versa, we can ramp up the color. And those are just ways that you can talk through with your clients or with your teams about how you can incorporate neurodiversity into your workplace.
That's amazing. So in thinking about how we're working today with all of the impact of COVID and all of the changes, because you're absolutely right, this is changing the way everyone works and is making everyone more sensitive. How would you apply this to those working remotely or in a hybrid situation?
I can take that one because it's something I've thought a lot about lately. I work every day from home, trapped in this one room, and I've thought a lot about, you know, how this would apply for everyone working remotely. I think the big thing here is we all have a heightened sensitivity to our surroundings now. So when we're going to be going back into spaces, we're all going to be a lot more hypersensitive entering new environments. But I think, you know, what's been important about working from home is we all have our specific sensory needs that we prefer over others. So I thought it was interesting when we started all of this work, we, started explaining this research to our designers, getting it embedded in everything that we do. And some of our designers were saying to Kay and I, like, well, I'm not neurodiverse, but if I were, I might say that I would prefer this over the other. Or, you know, we've even had clients say, oh yeah, this, doesn't really apply to us. I don't think we have any employees we need to accommodate that are neurodiverse. And it's like, the reality is we all are going to prefer a lower light level to a higher light level for certain different types of working. I even find that during the day, it's like, if I need to be reviewing a document in detail, I need to be completely in an enclosed room with the door closed with extra noise canceling headphones on to have that level of focus. But maybe if I'm in a more social environment, I would prefer, a different design attribute to that space. I even feel that sometimes I want to feel cozier. I want to have a blanket on me when I'm working from home or be in more of a lounge position versus some other tasks that require me to be at a desk or, in a more formal situation. So I think the key thing here is we all will have a heightened sensitivity returning to work, but we're able to, working from home, really customize our environment and our working experience. And I think people, as they return to the office, will be desiring that same level of control and choice regarding the environment that they work in.
Yeah, and Mary Kate, I think one of the other advantages, there are a lot of people that just don't feel comfortable in the workplace and or around people. And so the ability to work from home, which they may not have had before, limited their ability to be hired. And so now we can tap into a much wider range of people, whether it's, working parents that didn't want to have to travel or commute, whether it's people that just don't feel comfortable. And so I think it's actually been a big help. But on the flip side of that, for people that are hypo-sensitive and need that energy, if you're stuck in a space without any stimulation, you can be really struggling right now. And there's a lot of people that are feeling isolated right now. And so we're looking forward to the day where people really have options and choice, not only within the workplace, but about where they work in the first place.
Exactly. So what do you feel companies could do right now if they're looking at their existing space to make it more inclusive and more welcoming as people come back to work or take new jobs within a company?
Yeah. I'll take that one since I touched on it a little bit before. And so our recommendation would be to first just take a look at the obvious. And now that you know a little bit more about neurodiversity, try also looking at it through a slightly different lens. So color is a big one, that maybe you have either, not the right distribution of color through your space right now. Orientation is a big one, to take a look at what your flooring material is, see if it is contributing to the wayfinding through the space, and defining spaces in ways that help the employees rather than a distracting or something that would lead you astray if you're a person who always looks down at the floor. But we think the number one thing is to give people the choice to weigh in on what do your employees need in that space, to help the space be as inclusive as possible.
Yeah, I'm going to tag in and just say, are there rooms that you can convert that might be underutilized now that you could convert to focus rooms? Or can you create some fidget furniture spaces where people can move? Not everybody can sit around a conference for 2 hours in a meeting, so can we create a variety of meeting spaces that allow people to get up and maybe walk around or sit in the back or move or write on the wall? And again, I think the number one thing is really providing people with options and choices so that neurotypicals and neurodivergents alike can all find the space that fits not only their sensory perceptions of the spaces, but really address the task at hand that they're trying to perform.
Love it. And how, I guess this would apply to what Mary Kate and Kay, you mentioned earlier. How would you apply this in a COVID era? Sorry, excuse me.
Yeah, well, so I'm just going to tag on one thing, Mary Kate, before you jump in on that one. I think one of the things you think about prospect and refuge, and I want to pick up on something that Sarah said earlier. We're all prospecting when we go to the grocery store, right? We're all looking down the aisle. That is a really important concept. The number one concern right now is, am I safe? And do I have control? And what's coming around me? And where am I? And so having those clear lines, those vistas, and those areas that you can kind of tuck into and pop into are really important.
Yeah, and I think we just all have to be more sensitive as we're asking people or, making the journey back into the office or shared environments, just be more sensitive to what everyone's experiencing, because we've all seen the fights breaking out in the grocery store of people wearing masks versus not. And, everyone's on edge. Everyone has a heightened sensitivity. So I think, sensitivity and just understanding going back to work is going to be important. And, as Kay mentioned, we've unlocked, big corporations have unlocked this new acceptance of work from home policies. So that's great for people who are on the neurodiverse spectrum, who have a diagnosed condition, that might make them more hypersensitive, they now can perform their tasks at home in a secure environment and feel safe. But whether or not you've been necessarily diagnosed with a neurodiverse condition, this applies for everyone going back, I think. So, there's a lot of people who have been working in complete isolation who are craving that creative, collaborative experience going back. And then there are a lot of working parents at home who are ready to stop all the acoustic stimulation they've been getting in their homes and go back to a very controlled, quiet environment. So I think, whether or not people choose to continue to work remotely, there's always going to be the need to come back into the office at some point for something. And so I think just the more that we design these ecosystems of diverse spaces, it just supports everyone.
It does, and this is such a great opportunity. I know you probably don't hear that very often when speaking about COVID and workplace change, but it really does give us the platform and the reason to revisit everything that we do and how we do it. So this is a great way to take advantage of that.
Well, thank you guys for inviting me. Go for it.
Let's go for it.
Okay, so
let's invite everybody to the conversation.
So the very first question that we've gotten multiple times is there a recording of this? And the answer is yes. Everything that you just saw was pre-recorded on Inauguration Day, by the way, in the US. So that just shows you the focus that we have, because we know that was a crazy day in America. But it is recorded, and we are happy to share. And we are happy to share because we believe at HOK very, very strongly that this is something everyone needs to be talking about, because if we are the only ones that are talking about it, it doesn't get picked up and it doesn't impact as many people as it could or should be. Leslie, is it okay if I run through the questions?
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask you if you wanted to, because you'd been kind of.
Yeah, I've been monitoring them. And Sarah and Mary Kate, I'm going to have you tag in here. So one of the questions we also got is, how are we applying this to other sectors? We have started to tap into this with our science and technology group. We have started to tap into this with our airports. We're doing the San Francisco Airport Authority and the Toronto Airport, and both of those we are working with their teams to create more friendly environments for passenger travel. I can think of no places that are probably more stressful for people. And if you happen to be traveling with an autistic child, or I just can't even imagine a more nightmarish scenario. So it's important that we do address this in the public realm, and we have started to do that. One of the questions, Mary Kate, I think you started to answer this one, and it might have been answered when the question came in, but just if there's anything else you want to say to this, how do you address employees who think that if you're working from home, you're really not working? That's a whole other question, right? That's not even just neurodiverse, right? So I'm going to start by just saying this. Listen, if you don't trust your people, that's an HR issue. There's nothing that we can do with that. Like, in all honesty, I think that one of the things that we've all had to realize is that there's a tremendous amount of trust. And here's what I would say. I think it's always so funny. People are like, well, if I see you at the office, I know you're working. 90% of online shopping is done between 9 and 5, which means that person that you see working away at their computer is really shopping online, right? So just because you can see them doesn't make it any better, right? And I, so that's one of the arguments. But anything either one of you ladies want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that we're finding our own ways to be even more productive when we are able to completely control our environment. I'm at least feeling that way when I'm at home. I can completely block out my calendar for times when I need focus, and I can create a personalized space at home for exactly the most ideal environment to be able to focus in. So I think that's a huge benefit from working from home, having more control. And when we go back, as I mentioned, I think, being able to have choice and variety of spaces when we go back, we'll be able to find that kind of control in the workplace. But being from home, we're really able to control our own productivity more.
Yeah. Okay, so, and by the way, just because you can work from home doesn't mean you should. Some people are loving this, some people are hating it. This is why options and choices are so critical. All right, Sarah, I think we answered this question, but I'm just going to see if you want to say anything else on this. So if 1 in 8 people are neurodiverse, but fewer than 50% know it or have been diagnosed, how can we help them? Some people may not even realize that they would benefit from being in quieter spaces.
Yeah, variety is key here, right? That having, again, it's back to that choice option. That, you know, I can use myself as an example, right? That on the spectrum, I kind of fall in the middle. But there are days that having a nice quiet environment with lower light levels is better for my task at hand versus, you know, days where I need to be collaborative and bouncing ideas off of people where you want to be in a lively space. And so if you're just using, you know, consider what you need on a day-to-day basis and think about how that might apply to individuals who are actually diagnosed neurodivergent. You can see how it would start to be beneficial across the board to have different types of spaces for different types of people who need different things.
Perfect. Okay, and we got another question about working from home, and is there any research that shows that people are negatively impacted by working from home? The answer is, for some people, yes. If you're somebody who is not a self-starter, who you need constant reinforcement, who you feed off the energy of others, who you get distracted very easily and or a procrastinator, those are people that probably shouldn't work from home. You can go to HOK.com and there's a great piece that we wrote that calls just because you can doesn't mean you should, working remotely. And it talks about a lot of the issues and how you address some of those issues going forward. Okay, more, Mary Kate and Sarah. Are there any color patterns or textures that you would avoid altogether from a neurological or neurodiverse standpoint? We talked about that a little bit, but is there anything else you want to add to that?
I think it's key to have a variety, as we've been saying, kind of with all of this. But I saw another question that I think kind of ties into this. You know, when we have focus spaces that are designed for just one person, we're able to have different types of focus spaces throughout the office. So you might have one focus room that's super hypersensitive versus one that's hyposensitive. Those will have completely different materials. But when you have a social space where you're going to have an all hands meeting and you're expecting all of your employees to gather in one space, you have to have the variety there. So you have to have furniture where you're able to move and be in the center and be in a louder environment in a much more social setting. But then off to the side, you might have to have, you know, smaller booths or, you know, banquettes to the side of the social area where you feel like as a hypersensitive employee, you can still go to that all hands meeting or you can go to that happy hour at the end of the day, but you can kind of tuck yourself away to the side and feel like you have some comfort, a smaller scale, a different texture, or a different pattern than maybe the rest of the space. But you're able to coexist in one setting, being able to find little differences in the overall space.
So another great question about, are we capturing any data or is there any information about well-being and mindfulness? So I will say this, and I just want to kind of frame this up in general. It is very difficult right now to identify specifically what is positively impacting people that are neurodivergent and not, because so many people either don't even know that they are, and or their employees don't necessarily know that they are. And so it's hard to identify that. And so what we've really done is broaden our definition to everybody is being impacted by this. And yes, there is impact that shows when you can give people spaces where they can control the amount of distractions or feel more safe and secure, it has a positive impact on their well-being and their mindfulness. And IWBI has a lot of great information on that. Demi asked that question, and that might be a great place to go get the answer to that. Okay. One of the questions that we got is specifically around people that have neurological issues as far as vertigo, as far as, you know, migraines, et cetera. So I just wanted to answer and say, we are working with Target right now to talk about the fact, like Mary Kate said, that a lot of people who are neurodivergent don't want to look somebody in the face, right? They often will look down. And by the way, it's introverts can be that way too. You don't have to be neurodiverse to have that characteristic, but it does tend to be more prevalent. And so therefore you might be orienting yourself by floor patterns. And if the floor patterns are very, very confusing, you can get disoriented very easily, and or even if you have some issues with vertigo, it can be alarming to people. Also, sound is a big issue, right? So we're doing a lot of research right now about how white noise actually negatively impacts about 10% of people and actually makes people that might have migraines worse. So lighting is really important for people that have migraines, and sound. So creating rooms where they can dim the lighting, they can control the sounds, they can get out of a space that might have white noise, because again, that gives a lot of people headaches. And we're toying with introducing natural sounds. You just have to be careful though when you do that, right? Because, you know, even though birds may not be upsetting to people and it might be calming, if you're in an office and you hear chirping, it's not natural and you're looking around like, where's the damn bird, right? You know, so we have to be careful about introducing sounds that fit into the ecosystem without adding a new level of complexity. So audio and visual issues are very, very important, have a huge impact on people that are neurodiverse. And I think one of the things we've always done wrong with sound specifically is created the entire environment with one sound level, right? Like think about lighting. We vary lighting levels through space because some tasks need more, some tasks need less, and it helps with wayfinding and refreshing. We need to approach sound the same way. We should not have the same sound levels throughout the entire space. And that's one thing I think we need to be doing. Okay, more questions. From a design perspective, how can you ensure the right balance between the different needs? There obviously are conflicts between the different groups. And so how do we equate that out? So I'm going to go back to something that Mary Kate talked about, was those 6 modalities of work. Those 6 modalities, Sarah, I don't know, you've been doing this a long time. I've never seen a client that has, you know, equal shares of each one of those modalities. If I'm dealing with a research company or a pharma company that's doing research, they might have a lot more heads down concentrated work based on their work styles. Ad agencies might have a lot more creative based on what they do. And so in these responses that we've said that it's really important that we find out what are the work styles, what are the mobility profiles, what are the sensitivity levels. That helps us determine the right percentage of those modalities. You might need more of one for one company, you might need less of another one, and then creating options and choices so that people can have that control. How aware are employees in the US of what needs to happen and how are they embracing this? So I'm going to jump in, I'll start this and throw it to you ladies. I think there's a massive blind spot here, a massive. Europe is probably 4 years ahead of us on this. And even in Europe, they're primarily addressing this from an HR standpoint of how do we onboard people and how do we bring people into an organization. But they're not thinking about the fact that if we aren't creating spaces that people feel welcome in or can thrive in, they're going to fail. And, you know, sorry to say this, you know, we believe this is the right thing to do. But if that's not enough incentive for you, it's the law. You know, neurodiversity is considered a disability. We like to say it's a superpower, okay? But it is technically considered a disability by the Americans with Disability Act and the the EU or the UK Equality Act. Therefore, if somebody knocks on your door and says, I'm autistic or ADHD or, you know, early onset of Parkinson's and I need special accommodations, you are legally bound to provide those accommodations for them. And most HR people and corporate real estate people today would have no idea what that means. So I believe there's a huge lack of understanding around this topic. And it's something, you know, that's why we're out there professing this so much, is that we think it's really important that people understand that and start to address it more holistically. Ladies, anything you want to add to that?
Well, I just want to add to that, Kay, that, you know, we believe it's the right thing to do. It's the law. It's the best thing to do for the well-being of employees. But there's also a compelling business case here. You know, as if that wasn't enough, there's a compelling business case for corporations who are building out their workplaces. It's like the quote that you mentioned at the beginning. We're like freshwater fish swimming in salt water. Put us in freshwater, we thrive. You know, we think of this as a superpower, and employees are struggling to unlock those superpowers because they're just trapped in environments that are not supporting them to thrive and perform at their best.
And just to add to that, this is the perfect timing to start having these conversations with organizational leadership, right? Everyone is rethinking how people are working right now. And so it's a great time to say, hey, have we considered this workplace inclusivity? Has we considered neurodiversity and how that might impact our employees who have had, significant changes in the way that they've been working over the past, 12 to 14 months?
Okay, so here's a great question, and I'm going to get in trouble by the way that I'm answering this, but what the heck? Like I'll go for it. Are Target and HOK actively recruiting neurodiverse individuals, and if so, can you talk about your process? Okay. There are companies, SAP, EY, Microsoft, that actively have programs to onboard and identify and recruit people that are autistic, specifically because they have that super hyper focus. Think about Rain Man, right? The movie. And they've been able to prove that, they can be very, very productive when it comes to like coding and things like that. But remember, 1 in 8 people is neurodiverse. So you already have them in your companies. And I think we all internally joke that being designers and architects, we probably have a higher percentage in our company than most companies do, because we have a lot of people that need that kind of stimulation, et cetera. We are not necessarily actively recruiting for those, but we are acknowledging that we have a lot of people in the company that are working to address a lot of those issues. But if you want to know specifically, one of the best companies you can go and look to is Microsoft. And in Europe, there's a lot of different things about onboarding individuals from an HR standpoint. So, okay. One of the questions, I love this question too. Can the way one is raised affect whether they're hyper or hypo, or is it always based on, other things? And, depending on how we raise kids in environments and, in educational systems, et cetera, how are we dealing with that? I am not an expert on this. So I will say that is a medical issue, a question, but I will say from our research, we have found that is more of a nature, not a nurture. However, the way that you nurture people that have that nature can have a very negative or positive impact on them. And there was another question about, is this being addressed in schools? That's the primary space where this has been talked about because of kids now being diagnosed with ADHD. But, the whole thing is, we have a whole generation that was diagnosed and is coming out of K through 12, understanding what their specific needs are. And then they get to a workplace that has ignored it forever. And so that, I think, is what is partly driving awareness of this issue, but there's a lot of things that are done. It doesn't mean that every K through 12 does a great job of addressing this, and or a lot of them don't do anything from a space standpoint, but there is a lot that is being done in the educational realm. I would say not so much in higher ed, but absolutely in lower ed. That's being addressed. So another question is, as industries move more and more and more to a hybrid, are there any specific risk looming for people that are neurodiverse? If we are about to kind of go deep in on this. So what do you guys think? I look at hybrid workplaces as giving people more options and choices. So I think it's a good thing if they have the right setup in those environments.
Yeah, agreed.
I agree. Yeah, just again, back to that choice factor, that if you've got the option to work from home, it does come back to trusting employees. I know we talked about that earlier in this session, but that's a key element here, is trusting employees to, to figure out what setting works best for them so they can be most productive.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's a great question too from Christy. I guess sitting in a work environment with low to no panels would be highly difficult for hypersensitive individuals. Yeah, it could be. People that are introverts as well. If you took somebody that's an introvert and you put them right into the middle, And I actually would argue that there's a greater difference between introverts and extroverts than there are than baby boomers and millennials. And we focus so much on demographics and we're ignoring all these other real things. But if you are hypersensitive and you are in an environment where you have absolutely no control, it can literally short circuit you because your spidey sense is just constantly going off. And that whole concept that, Mary Kate and Sarah were talking about as far as prospect and refuge, if you don't feel safe, if you don't feel settled, those are your basic human instincts. If those are not met, you cannot truly achieve at a higher level. You really cannot. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's like a Jenga pyramid. If all the pieces at the bottom are missing, the top isn't going to stand, right? And so it's really important that we address that.
And I do think there is a way, sorry, Kate, to be a hypersensitive person and work at a workstation with low to no panels. But I think the key there is the modalities of work that we discussed. So nobody should have to sit at a workstation for 8 hours, and that's the only environment that you work in. You might work well at a workstation for one task, but at another, you have to move to a different environment.
All right, so we have another great question. I'm in the UK working on a large public body organization. I'm an architectural designer who is tasked with redesigning their entire organization for over 4,000 people. How do you feel with me using some of your space typologies? Go for it. Anything that we put out there is in the public realm. We believe that we have a responsibility to the industry as a large firm to be able to support the industry. Of course, I would love to be able to work with that client, but if I can't, then at least, we're happy to share all the information that we're doing. But yes, we believe that it's important that, these things and these issues are addressed for all of our clients because it impacts all of us. And that just means there's one less article that I'm going to have to read in the future that says how stupid open plans are if you get it right. So you'll be doing me a favor because I can't take any more of those articles or I'm just going to go nuts. Okay, so flooring. So one of the questions, like with flooring, have you explored using louder or softer finishes for hypo and hypersensitive things in other areas or in other attributes? So I'm going to say yes, specifically in quiet rooms and in phone booths or whatever. But Sarah, you want to elaborate a little bit maybe on how materiality and those things can help?
Absolutely. The materiality of any specific finish, whether it's the flooring, the wall covering, the ceiling, all of those elements have both the aesthetic properties, acoustical properties, and there are subliminal things that come from those materials as well. You think about a concrete look floor has a colder look or feel to the space than something like a plush carpet. Those different things contribute to an overall sense of an individual space. And you also have to think about the environment that you're using those different textures in, right? You think about in a big airport, you don't want something to have a super slick floor because people have a sense of like, I want to make sure that I've got a good footing when I'm running for my flight. That helps give them a sense of security within that space. So that's an extreme example, but the textures of the space, all of those elements have to be considered. The texture and materiality, the aesthetics, the acoustics, when you're designing in a neurodiverse environment, because those little things make a big difference.
Yep. Okay, we have 3 questions that kind of relate to each other about, what do we predict because of COVID? Are we going to be working from home? Are we going to continue to see flexible work environments? Do we need larger workspaces? What do we think is going to change? If I had to look into my crystal ball, and I do have one because I spend a lot of my time doing future casting because we have clients with millions of square feet and they don't like surprises, I would say this. If you had too much space before COVID, you probably have too much space after COVID. That reality hasn't changed, and a lot of our clients did. If you had the right amount of space before COVID, you might be shifting the way that you use space. If you increase your work from home policy and allow people to work in a hybrid manner, and if you go to unassigned seating, if you insist everybody has an assigned desk, and you're going to need additional spacing, and you're going to need more generous meeting areas, et cetera, you might actually need more square footage. I would not recommend that for anybody. What I would recommend is that we embrace the ecosystem. We allow people to work as they organically have in a variety of settings. We put some policies and procedures around it, so it's not just a total free-for-all. We know that people feel and function the best when they have 1 to 2 days a week of flexibility. And then the office becomes a hub where there's less individual assigned spaces and more intuitive, smarter work points that are unassigned and more graciously spaced and appointed gathering spaces that create a compelling enough environment that people actually want. And those spaces might be smaller than they are now, but they are built out to a higher level so that they're places people want to be. Think about what you can't get at home. That's what you need to do in the office. And so I hope that answered all 3 of those questions at once. Leslie, we are at the top of the hour and we could go for hours, but I want to
and there are more questions.
I think I just answered the last 3.
I think so. The good part is this has been recorded. This will also be posted on the Great Indoors where we house our research, and I'm sure we can share it with HOK so they can post it on their website as well. And we want you all to join the conversation because we do want more advocates for this. And how do we grow this awareness and help for the greater good? So we're really excited. And ladies, I can't thank you enough for sharing your knowledge and expertise because it is awe-inspiring, truly. And we really appreciate it. So
there's a huge team behind all of us, and we have to thank all of them. They're literally, this has been picked up by the firm, just across, and we have multiple experts in multiple markets. It's growing to other sectors, and so we're really excited. Leslie, I think you have the links to all of the presentations if you want to send those out to the people. And then, of course, you can always share our email, and we're happy to answer any questions if we didn't get to some of the questions today. We got to 38 questions, though. That was really good.
You're amazing that way. I am so glad you just took the ball and ran with it. Thank you.
Gotta be quick.
You got to be on it. Well, thank you, ladies. And thank you all for participating today and keeping the conversation lively. We really appreciate you taking time. We know that an hour, even when you're working from home, is hard to focus for that long. And we appreciate it and look forward to continuing the conversation soon. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks.